Hi students, this is Dr. Elizabeth Lohr, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to annotate text in a way that helps you understand what the writer is saying and to help you remember what you've read even several days later. So before we get started, I'd like you to take a piece of paper or open a document um, in your computer and answer these questions in a short little paragraph. And when you're finished, turn the video back on. Okay, so let's first talk about why we annotate. First, we annotate because it helps us to stay focused on what the author's saying. I know that sometimes when I'm reading something for a class that is a requirement, but the particular text I'm reading is not very interesting, it's really easy for my attention to go to things that I have to do later on today, or other classes that I have to do, or what's for lunch. So when I have a pen or pencil in my hand and I know that I have to make notations, I tend to stay a little more focused. The other reason why we do this is because it helps us to interact with what the author's saying. We can't develop opinions about what they're saying if we don't interact with it in some way. And the annotating helps us to do that because we would be writing questions, we would be writing opinions, that sort of thing. So, and the main reason we're doing this is because writing and highlighting your reactions to what the author has said helps you to remember what the author is saying in the article. The other reason that we annotate is to help us to be able to review the articles later in a quarter or during research projects. So say you have an article that you read at the beginning of the quarter and you find out it's going to be on your midterm, or you might need to use it for a research paper later on. You don't want to have to read the entire thing all over again. So what you'll do instead is you'll just go through your annotations and you'll read a little brief summary that you've put at the end, and that should help you to remember what the article is, to be able to see whether you need to read it closer or whether you can just put it aside. So what I'm going to teach you is an annotation system that I developed over time as I went through grad school. When I was an undergrad, I spent most of my time just using a yellow highlighter, and most of the time I didn't remember why I highlighted those things in the first place, because there was no annotation next to it to help me remember what it was that I thought was so important. So as I was in grad school and I had to keep better track of what the authors were saying in order to know whether they'd be useful to me in the future, I developed this color system that I found really helps me to review these articles without having to read too much. So the first one that I use pink or red for this one, and this is the main thesis or controlling idea of the text. Now I do find that the more professional the texts happen to be, the the harder it is to be able to find one particular sentence that says what the controlling idea is. Most of the time, it's a central idea that flows throughout the text, and so I will generally highlight different sentences that seem to be giving me the controlling idea. Now, some texts do give it to you within the first or second paragraph, but that's not always the case. The second is, I use the yellow because the yellow is something that we've used many times, and so I use the yellow for things that are most important, most interesting, and or that are of difficult concepts that I want to maybe ask about in the class later. I use green for definitions. So the definitions could be just a word that I just don't know. Even at this level of my reading and writing, I still at times will come across a word that I don't know. So I'll put a little symbol in the margin, or actually I'll put the symbol next to the word, and then I go to the margin and put the symbol again and then put the definition of the word so I don't have to look it up again. Sometimes the authors will give keywords, and so I will usually highlight those and and like I usually highlight the word and then I underline the definition so that I can see it very quickly. Blue I use for people that are mentioned. So I use this as a way to keep track of different people that the author mentions because they have quoted that person or they are giving credit to that person for something that they've said. And this helps so that I don't accidentally say that it's the author's words, but I remember then that it's actually somebody else's words. I also use this, like say in a story that I need to annotate for some reason. I annotate either the names of the characters, but I also annotate things like um, the girl or the unfamiliar stranger, something like that, because that's still a person that I want to remember was there. Tone of voice, sarcastic, humorous, angry, urgent, sincere, any of those kind of tone of voices that you might have, I put those in purple. And I do this so that I can make sure that I understand the tone of voice of my author, because if my author's being humorous or sarcastic, but they're saying something that could sound like they're being judgmental, I have to remember that this is supposed to be funny. And a good example of this is the paper The Onion, which is online obviously now. But in The Onion, they say a lot of stuff that isn't true, but they say it in a sarcastic, humorous way so that you know it's not true. And so you're not likely to take it verbatim. So I do those in purple because I think it helps me better understand where the author's coming from. Biases and assumptions, this I write them in the margin. It's important to know these, especially if you're going to be using them in your own papers. You want to make sure that you understand that this particular author has a particular bias, or that the author has a certain assumptions of you as a reader, expects you to know certain things. And so you want to keep that in the margins. I also, in the margins, I also write responses, questions, insights, anything that I may want to talk about in class, anything that I just may want to keep track of so that I can just go back to them later. And then in certain classes, probably in a lot of classes actually, you want to make sure that you are making connections to other texts that you're reading in the class, because there's a reason why those texts are all chosen. So even in this particular class, we're going to have those moments. So what I tend to do is I will write the other author's name in the margin, or I'll write the title of the article or a summarized title. And sometimes I'll even write what that particular text is about, why it reminds me of what's just been said. So I wanted to show you an example of what this looks like. So when I annotate a text, one of the first things that I do is I put, let me get this little arrow here. Let's see, I'll just get a little pen. So the first thing that I do is I try to split my article into sections where I can see a shift in how the author is talking about like different subpoints. And so for instance, I have a little, sorry, a little brown line here, dotted line. That tells me that's the end of this author's introduction. So this author has a 2-paragraph introduction. And as you can see, I've used the pink here to indicate that this seems to be his, or at least part of his central idea. And I wrote here in purple anger because the tone of voice of this thesis area is in a tone that's pretty angry. Let's see, I have yellow. I think I was also using orange here just because of the pens that I had. Again, the colors you use aren't as important as making sure that you have the different things that I've asked you to look at. It helps if you stick with the colors for this particular class, but then change the colors as you go. So as you can see here, I've used the blue for student and a liberal colleague of mine that helps me know who he's talking about. I think, yeah, because Stephen Carter is up here, and this is the colleague that he's talking about down here. Uh, so let's see. Here again, we have frustration and anger. And here's a little note, admits that everyone does this so that we know that what he's thinking. Here again, we see that dotted line here because this is going into his section. Oh, and I wanted to show you, so I also put these little titles to the different sections. So here, this author has, Dalton, he has 3 main points that he is trying um, to put across in this paper, in this article. So here's his first point. So I put a number 1, and I put a little title here, not judged by merit, so that I remember what that particular section is. Then I don't have to go back and read it again. Here I put that this is a summary of part 1. And again, I have my dotted line. And here's number 2, which is that we are not equal. And then I put here not bare basis, number 3. So one of the other things that I do, like for instance, here he talks about Colin Powell, but this was before Obama was um, elected president. So now, I put now Obama. Oops, sorry about that. So that I remember what his example is supposed to be um, showing. So here, as you can see in blue, I have practicing lawyers, sitting judges, politicians. Even just looking at that, it helps me remember what he was talking about in that section. Here I've written in brown, and I can't remember what this was supposed to. Myth is still desirable, but reinforces pecking order. And so this I put here, central argument. Um, and here's some more. Again, here's the pink because this is part of his central idea here, sarcasm and anger. So one of the other things that I wanted to point out to you is when your author repeats things like this, there is a reason why they're doing this. They're trying to get your attention. And so what you'll see here is in this article, the author repeats the word yes. And the way that the reason for this yes is that he is being a bit sarcastic and showing anger and frustration at the different excuses that people might say. And so he says, yes, slavery was built on the notion that Africans were property and not persons. So he's basically saying, here are all the things that people might bring up. And so he's showing some sarcasm. He's also showing some anger. Here, promise versus reality is something he was talking about here. He talks about color blindness here, talking about how this is not a good thing. Sometimes I'll also put stars next because here he talks about 2 main things that he wants us to keep in mind. And then here I have another division because this is where he starts to go into his, sorry, that's where he starts to go into his conclusion. I wanted to show you one other annotation. Now, sometimes we're not annotating just to remember or understand. We're looking for particular things that in our analysis of this. So I wanted to also show you this one. This is the first page of a story called Pinochle by Mark Lehner. And what I was trying to show students in this particular one is how interesting, how interesting his descriptions are. So the adjectives and the active verbs with adverbs, descriptions of actions. I wanted students to annotate specifically for these particular things because they were looking at how to show versus telling in a story. And so when you look at the description of his grandmother that he's describing here, he talks about the fact that she's in a robin's egg blue cashmere cardigan, as opposed to just saying a blue cardigan, a yellow scarf knotted jauntily. So looking at the adverbs and adjectives there, trembling, um, swallows, says with a shrug, dribbles, snarls, inquires, quotes. So sometimes your teachers may ask you to highlight particular things, or maybe this is just what you want to do as you're reading a story. Maybe you want to write a paper about it, about how the adjectives have a particular effect in the story. So you would want to underline all those things in a particular color, or the adjectives or the active verbs. And so sometimes you won't necessarily use the system that I've asked you to use here, but you use a different system for yourself in order to help you notice things in a text. And I think I will be asking you to do some of that as well. So there's two different types of annotations. One, which is a system that I've just taught you. The other is this one where you're using annotation to look for particular things. Alrighty, so when you've finished your annotation, what you want to make sure to do is also write a brief review at the end of it, because you want to make sure that you remember it without having to read the entire article, right? So you would write a brief, 2, 3 sentences at the end, reminding yourself what the article was about. So first, what the article was about, what were the author's main points, and how helpful was this article for your current project or for the class as a whole. And I have an example for you here. So this is an example from the Dalton article that I just showed you. And here I wrote, Dalton argues that Algiers' story Ragged Dick creates false hope through a rags to riches story that claims everyone can achieve the American dream, and that this myth is socially destructive. He first states the 3 messages Algiers' story disseminates. 1, we are judged only by our capabilities. 2, we all have the same opportunities to grow our skills. 3, in the end, merit brings success. He continues by showing why each of these mythical messages do not ring true for many inhabiting the US, because race and class have a negative influence on society. So you see, it's just a couple of sentences, but now if I go back to this article, several months or weeks from now, I can just read this and it will help me remember what this is about. I can also look at my annotations, and my annotations will make certain things pop out to help me remember what he was saying along the way. And then that way, I don't necessarily have to read the whole article again to remember whether or not this article is going to be helpful for either the exam I'm taking or for the paper I'm writing. Okay,